Anyway, hi, this is Paul, and I've got Esther on the channel today. And to me, that's always a fun time because Esther, I probably have more, I have more DM back and forths with you in the Twitter DM than anybody else. Not even close. Esther is always sending me good stuff. Oh, did you catch this tweet? Did you read this article? This is my thoughts about this. This is what's going on with this person. And so Esther has been a conversation partner pretty much right from when I started on YouTube with the Jordan Peterson stuff, and you can find Esther's stuff on various blogs. And are you going to get in Substack? I mean, you're going to do that instead of Pathos, or what are you thinking?
I don't know. I mean, Substack is what all the cool kids are doing. I don't know if I'm a cool enough kid yet to do that. The Patheos is a mixed. It has its pros and cons. It has reach, which Substack doesn't quite have, and also I like free content. I don't like people having
Yeah.
to pay to read my stuff, but I could always just make it free. So thinking about it, mulling different things.
Yeah. So Esther also has a chapter in, let's see, I should have the book here somewhere. This book, the myth and meaning of Jordan Peterson, which Ron Dart, who's been on the channel a number of times, Ron edited. So Esther has a chapter in there. Esther's followed the Jordan Peterson thing quite closely. But where do you want to start today, Esther? There's been a lot going on, and what's up at the top of your salience hierarchy right now, and we'll see where we go from there.
Well, so the one of the most recent things that just came out that I actually wrote it a couple months ago, but um, my friend Owen Strachan, who's kind of a bigwig, it's in a certain kind of conservative evangelical tribe, um, approached me and asked me to do a profile of Douglas Murray for a new magazine that he has called Permanent Things. And I'd done something more generally IDW related for him before. Uh, so I wrote that and was really proud of it. I just really enjoyed getting to highlight like elements of Douglas's work that I find really interesting, but most people don't talk about as much, that don't get kind of hit in his press junket interviews where you can always predict exactly what he's going to say. Um, but because I've actually like read really widely and I know all these different kind of facets of his stuff, I was able to pull that out and pull it together. And then Douglas actually retweeted it, which was nice. Um, very kind of him. Um,
Well, you've been a big pusher of Douglas Murray. I know Esther is always, oh, you need more Douglas Murray on your channel. Do more Douglas Murray. And he just has never really, I've looked at his Madness of the Crowds and his other book, and I have appreciation, and he's a tremendously skilled writer, and he's so witty. He just got such a sharp wit. But what about him do you think is, besides some of the obvious things? Yeah, he's a sharp wit, he's a clever writer, he's obviously as a gay man, in some ways he can push on this stuff in ways that I can't, let's say. But what about his work is so important, do you think?
yeah, the problem with Douglas is that um, so like some of his best stuff is like buried treasure. Like you kind of have to be really going back through the archives of things he's written and his background and stuff to kind of turn over these gems and start to form a more complete picture than the super witty guy who writes about woke stuff. Um, and you see bits of it in The Strange Death of Europe, I think. I actually prefer that book to The Madness of Crowds. Um, but I mean, I think partly what attracts me to Douglas, I mean, it's also part of what attracted me to Jordan Peterson, which is that I think he embodies a kind of older form of humanism, um, which I talk about a lot. But what I mean by that is the very humane view of mankind, uh, and and history. And one of the things that Douglas has written about quite a bit, but he's never put it between covers, so people don't really touch on it much. But he's written quite a bit about euthanasia and suicide, assisted suicide, and life issues. And he comes at it from a British perspective, and so it's a little alien from the American perspective. I mean, when American conservatives and Christians talk about life, pro-life, pro-choice, I mean, these tribal lines are drawn in certain ways with certain focal points and hot button issues. So it could be a little hard for people to kind of get into a British writer's perspective on that, because so many things that are hot button issues in America are really not so much in the UK. You know, like so many ships have already sailed, right? Like there is no pro-life struggle back and forth. It's not something that politicians talk about. And there can also be a tendency in English culture when it comes to end of life, to suicide, a kind of an old Roman perspective that it's better to choose the time of your death and to die with dignity than to be reduced to being old and decrepit and helpless. So Douglas really has fascinated me in his writing on that topic because he takes a much more life-affirming view, saying, I believe that life is actually valuable even at the worst moment, even in the weakest moment. I want to affirm, like Peterson affirms, that there can be meaning in that. And he'll draw on literature, on Shakespeare, on a moment at King Lear when a man's son stops him from committing suicide. And in the last moments of his life, he discovers everything, you know. And he was arguing about this with a guy who was pro-suicide, and Douglas was trying to say, no, like, I don't think our bodies are actually our own. I don't think that we have the right necessarily to make that choice. And it almost sounds like C.S. Lewis a little bit. It almost echoes things that Lewis has said. And so, I mean, that's just like one element. And then I think also I'm just in general very fascinated by figures who are haunted by faith in Christianity. So Roger Scruton might be another example of this. But this sad kind of deconstruction story of having grown up in the church and being terrified by what he thought was the pulling back of the curtain and realizing there was nothing there. But that now it's like he keeps kind of wandering back, and he'll go to Nigeria. It's a personal risk, you know, and he'll encounter people who are living out their faith in this incredibly stark, authentic manner. And it just hits him like like Vervaeke's piece, the sort of the participatory. I mean, these are not analytical or intellectual people. They're just living out their faith. And Douglas is sort of attracted to that. I can feel it in him. It's like a moth to a flame, you know? And it's like he's longing for that, but he's trapped in this kind of arid post-Christian UK, European West. But it's like he catches a bit of it when he hangs out with people in the Middle East or people in Africa who are actually under fire for their faith, but he can't get there himself. And so there's something really compelling and haunting to me about that.
That's interesting. That's really helpful. I haven't read Murray anywhere near as deeply as you have, or paid as much attention to him, but that helps me understand your fascination with him. What one of the conversations, we all sort of imagine, I'd like to see these two people talk. And how do you think a conversation between Douglas Murray and Tom Holland would go?
I think they would agree on a lot. Of course, you'd have to get past these kinds of conversations. They always take their time to unfold, and that generally, just as they're getting really interesting, it's time for things to wrap up. So this is why I like the long form dialogue much better. But I think Tom would be careful. I mean, Tom's not certainly not like a missionary for Christianity, because he himself is in such a tentative position.
Although
But
he's been on Justin a lot. I mean,
he
Tom
has.
Tom in his Tom has been doing interesting things on that. Anyway, keep going, keep going. I shouldn't interrupt.
I think Tom might ask Douglas what he would think about leaning into the story or surrendering to the story, the way that Tom talks about. And Douglas would probably say that he sees the appeal in it, that he wouldn't fault Tom at all for doing it. He can understand why, but he would just say, I just can't. It's not really going to work for me. It would probably, something similar to what he said in our dialogue when Justin always pops the question, the way he does.
He does.
What would it take for you, Douglas? It's so gentlemanly, Justin, but he's always, and I mean, what I appreciated so many things about that conversation, but I appreciated how Douglas was very careful to say that he didn't feel like it was his intellectual integrity that he would be giving up if he were to become a Christian. He was like, I'm not saying that. I know some people will say that, but that genuinely is not what it is for me. That I feel like the only way to to be intellectually complete would be to not become a Christian. And I'm kind of thinking, yeah, I mean, I can I can see that. I could see why. And I think also Tom and Douglas would share many of the same fears. Many of the same fears that we're losing something, that we're kind of on the edge, that the center can't hold, to quote the poem. So then it would kind of come to well, what do we do now? It's like, well, and you've kind of touched on this in some of your videos. I think Tom is closer. Tom is closer to getting over the edge, but he's not there yet. And I mean, the way I've been thinking about it is Tom needs a good marriage counselor between the two different parts of himself.
That's really clever.
But also, I mean, look, Tom's not gay. I mean, we just say that, okay? I mean, there's so much there with the gay thing, which certainly, as you've very astutely pointed out, and I would completely agree with you, that does not mean that Douglas is in a hurry to run into the arms of a gay affirming church. Right. In fact, I think Douglas, probably with the kind of integrity that we would expect of him, would say, oh stop it, stop it. Come on, it's like, you don't really. I've read Romans 1, like so I like, that's not really gonna be like, oh, okay, well we'll put up a rainbow flag. Is that gonna? Well, no, not really. But anyway.
Now that's I had a conversation yesterday with someone from we didn't have the conversation on the Discord server, the Bridges of Meaning Discord server, but he got one of the rando slots and we did a conversation and we recorded it. Now I'm putting pressure on him because I thought it was a really good conversation, but of course I always tell people, you can listen to it first, and I will not post it without your permission. There's no question about that. But now I'll get to needle him because he is someone who didn't grow up in the church, but has, sort of was swept up in the Jordan Peterson thing. And so, came to the Bridges of Meaning Discord server, watched my videos, and he, obviously there's a heavy Christian contingent on the Bridges of Meaning Discord server, sometimes too heavy. And, so I was talking to him about, well, let's talk about the church, and let's talk about why because he's, some of the people on the Discord server are, well, COVID is always a complexity, but are going to church or are sort of getting closer to the church. And this individual this individual isn't so far. Um, and he talked about, he says, I sometimes think we sort of need a um, kind of a 50%, a halfway. And I got a ton of thoughts about that idea. But when I look at Murray and I look at Holland, that's sort of where they're at, you know. Um, Not necessarily identifying with, and that's a little distinct from Peterson, who, lying pastors. I think we'll sooner see Murray and Tom Holland sneaking into church, and that partly has to do also with the UK culture versus North America, and of
Yes.
course Canada is different from the United States. So
Right. At this, I mean, I should say, like, to why Murray in particular appeals to me. In a sense, I understand Murray really well because in a way we come from the same tribe as far as our church background. Um, because I grew up in the Anglican Church, he grew up in the Anglican Church, so all the language of liturgy, and the like the King James Bible and the Book of Common Prayer and all this stuff that's just in his blood, like, it's part of his frame. Even though now he's an atheist, he still carries all that stuff with him. I carry all that with me as well. And so Peterson didn't have that growing up in the United Church of Canada. He just had this kind of, boring nominalist going through the motions. So Peterson never really understood the appeal of church. Uh, he
the
never
aesthetic
saw.
appeal.
Yeah, right. Because there were no aesthetics for him to latch onto. There was none of that power of the language and the beauty to stir the soul that Murray knew and that Holland knew. And so they're still haunted by that in a way that Peterson isn't. He just doesn't understand it.
Well, it's boy, this stuff gets complex because, of course, I mean, Tom Holland has talked about the dinosaur issue. And when did Murray? I mean, I don't know Murray's story as well.
Hmm.
When did he sort of divorce from the church? Was he in it longer?
Uh, that's a good question. I think they were about of an age when they kind of officially made their break. But with Murray, and I mean, it's funny because even though in a way he's culturally very alien to the American experience, there's a lot of elements in there that kind of sound like stuff Rhett and Link and all these other
Yeah.
deconstruction people are saying. But when he was in high school, I get this impression of a very, very intense, nerdy high school kid, with whom I probably would have been thick as thieves if we'd been friends together. But that he was just devouring all kinds of books on his own and going to bookshops and libraries and grabbing whatever he could find. And he actually landed on like some old higher criticism, like 19th century stuff, like not even, I mean, it wasn't like the newer stuff that's out now, but he just kind of sat down and was like trying to kind of wrestle his way through these really big, long, thick books. And he freaked out because it seemed like, oh my gosh, they figured it out. They figured out that the Bible, I can't actually trust the Bible, and these texts are da da da. So that's when he was like 15, 16. And so then he said he stopped reading because it was just like too scary and he didn't want to think about it. He was just like, I'm just going to go back and keep kind of going through the motions because this scares me too much. But it just kind of ate away at him as he got into college, and then came out as gay around like 22, which obviously played into it. He's like, well, hey, the Old Testament, it says you should stone gays, and so that seems obviously immoral, and I don't see how the Bible is going to be a guide to moral living and in the West today and that kind of thing. And he said that it was actually studying Islam and the provenance of the Quran that was like the straw that kind of broke the camel's back for him, because he was like, I mean, I don't think that the Muslims guy heard voices, so why am I still sort of clinging on to Christianity? If Muhammad didn't hear voices, why do I think my guy did? and he felt like he was applying a double standard, which he couldn't in honesty and integrity keep up. And so he kind of publicly kept it up for like another year or so. And when the Spectator did a survey, like how many of our writers believe in the virgin birth, he said, yes, I do believe in the virgin birth, because it seems like, why go halves? Either you believe it all or you don't believe any of it. So he said that, but then a year later, he did a coming out piece where he said, I lied to this newspaper a year ago when I said I believed in the virgin birth. I actually, in my heart, really didn't believe it, but I said it because I was still in this in-between phase. But now I can't do this anymore. I have to come out and say publicly that I'm an atheist. And then he went into some of the history I just gave and studying Islam and that kind of thing. But what was interesting is that even though he was really good friends with Christopher Hitchens and some of those new atheist guys. But it's like he kind of felt like they had done all of the work as new atheists, like kind of putting Christianity to bed. And he was now going to go after Islam. So then that was the trajectory that his career took, that he didn't become a professional atheist in the same way that they did. He became a political figure, and that took its course. But so I mean that's kind of his story. It's a sort of classically Victorian story. And I mean, if you read about, I've read quite a bit about 19th century crisis of doubt, crisis of faith, and it feels, it's very Dover Beach, the melancholy, long withdrawing roar, where you just feel like, well, it's over. It's just you can't go back. And of course, I'm over here going, yes, you totally can. You totally can. But he doesn't think he can. And so that, it's very, very, yeah, it's sad. It's a sad story.
Well, of course, Lewis, made his way back. And Lewis was living in the 19th century, unlike the rest of these guys. And
barely, but yeah.
Barely, but, I was thinking about, who was I thinking about this morning? It wasn't Lewis. It was someone more recent, but this echoing meaning crisis that we see. And, Lewis's, it's interesting. It's interesting to me the way Lewis and Tolkien just seem to endure in this space, how they... Oh, I remember what I was thinking about. Have you ever read Shantung Compound by Langdon Gilkey?
No, and I put it on my list when I watched your latest video. Yeah. But that looks like the kind of thing I should read. So yeah,
that'll be a little tasty snack for you. It's a very fast read.
I love that kind of thing. Yeah.
Oh yeah, it's very engaging, and Gilkey is interesting in that, of course, he's an American of sort of East Coast liberal Christian establishment, but just observing what he did in that compound. I read that book and thought, wow, we're the Catholics and the Protestants and the fundamentalist missionaries versus the liberal missionaries. Of course, I haven't posted my conversation with Bern Power yet. Bern kind of wants me to post it a little later in the month. I don't know if we'll be able to hold back so long, but there's just so many moving pieces to this thing. And it's, I've never been to the UK. I don't know much about the UK in most of what I'm learning in terms of culture and characters are now through conversations on the Discord or back and forth on Twitter or Glenn. And it's, watching Tom, because I've watched Tom more closely than I've watched Douglas Murray. It's interesting how there is a sort of a redux happening with these guys with respect to, Lewis is a funny saint for evangelicals in a lot of ways. He had how he got into his relationship with Joy Davidman, hardly a nice, clean narrative. he's got a lot of views that many evangelicals in the United States would not be terribly comfortable with, but yet he sort of comes roaring into this space as an odd saint and a teacher. And you know, I'm I think you especially, always keeping Douglas Murray in front of me, and now watching Tom Holland, it's going to be very interesting to see what happens in the UK with respect to the church and religion. And again, another thing, just listening to you a minute ago, noting the commonality of sort of the what being confronted with Islam sort of becomes like a pail of cold water.
Mm-hmm.
And we're just sort of drifting off into post-Christian, nostalgia, and we like the buildings, and maybe we'll sneak into a church for evensong, and we don't really care. I mean, it's almost like the royalty. We love to snip at it and be snide about it, but we don't really want to get rid of it necessarily. As long as it doesn't cost too much, we'll leave it hanging around.
Mm-hmm.
And then Islam comes onto the fore, and it's like, and of course Tom Holland sort of roaring in with Dominion, saying, with an Islamist saying, well, hey, pick on your own religion. And it's like, okay, and doing the spade work and finding himself going in some different directions, and then only, okay, now that I've read this stuff and talked about this stuff and learned this stuff, where does it go in my life? And then listening to him, I thought the conversation he did with Justin Brierley, and I forget who the third party was there, about the pandemic, that was
couple other guys. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I thought Tom Holland's he's just an interesting guy anyway, because I follow him on Twitter, and he is a fun guy, and he comes through in his writing. But his take on the church and the pandemic has been fascinating, and sort of a deep longing for re-enchantment.
Yes, and I mean he and Douglas were like they were like practically tag teaming each other all through the spring, like writing variations on the same article, severely burning the C of V at the bishops. And Douglas wrote an especially heartbreaking piece about this old church, St. Margaret's, which has got all this history attached to it, and it had been his family church. And then the building closed because of the pandemic. And Douglas was just so heartbroken and angry about this, because the way he put it is, I thought, well, the people might leave the church, but the church wouldn't leave the people, or would it? And he talked about, we had this community. There were like maybe 300 people there. They came from like a variety of different backgrounds and stuff, but they were sitting next to each other in pews and forming bonds. And now it's like just gone, just dispersed. And it was so sad. And I think there's like a mingled sadness and contempt there, for like just the impotence of the Church of England. And back to Islam, Douglas especially will kind of make this contrast when he'll talk about friends of his he knows. Like he'll talk about the woman who's at a club drinking and suddenly realizes that her life doesn't have any meaning. Well, what's she going to do now? What's she going to find? Well, increasingly, those people are finding Islam, because Islam comes in, and David Nasser, coming out of a Muslim background, will bring that in too. And Islam is tough and muscular, and it has these regulations, and it's sort of compelling. It offers a higher purpose. So a lot of these young people will kind of drift towards that, and Douglas will say there's no voice like that. There's nothing similarly compelling on offer from Christianity in the UK or Europe today. And so that's not where they're drifting. Instead, they're drifting to these other, much more dangerous things.
What's happening with we've got two Americans talking about Europe, but where is, and again, but I think about Tom Holland's. He's mentioned this in a number of, because I follow Holland not quite as closely as I follow Peterson, but I follow Holland fairly closely. I mean, he's mentioned the experience he had watching the Pope stand next to an icon in a sealed off, St. Peter's Square, and and then of course Holland hearkening back to I think it was Thomas a Becket and another and other pandemics, of course, because Tom would know these things.
I would, yes.
And but just you would think a number of the people I'm getting to know on the Discord server are European Roman Catholics from Germany, and because people often don't recognize that there are a lot of Roman Catholics in Germany and the Netherlands and England and some of these spaces that we tend to associate with Protestantism, but the Roman Catholic Church was never fully exorcised from many of these places. And one would imagine that if the Anglican Church is weak, well, where are the Catholics? But very quickly you get the sense that these in Europe, the religion, the religious in the secular definition of religious, the small religion, the small r religion, that plays quite a bit differently in Europe, partly due to the long history, whereas here in the States, religion is much more of a modern enterprise in terms of these are voluntary communities. There's no state support. Your religion is either going to live or die on the vibrancy of those who embrace it. It's not going to linger in the buildings and the stories and the history like it will in Europe.
Yeah, and then Rod Dreher's story is so instructive and interesting to see, like his tracing his journey out of the church. And it's interesting to me that Tom was, I understand why Tom was struck by that image of Francis. It's a very compelling picture, certainly. But the grass is not necessarily greener. And if you talk to a lot of Catholics, both European and American, there's a great deal of Sturm und Drang about Francis. And just like divisions within the church. And sometimes I'll hear a Protestant go, "Oh, I'm thinking maybe becoming Catholic. Like, I just love the unity." I'm like, no. Let me explain. And like, so somebody on Twitter said, "I'm old enough to remember when the question, 'Is the Pope Catholic?' was rhetorical." So, I get it, but at the same time, there's way more layers under the surface of all this stuff,
Well, you've written recently too about deconstruction, and I've touched on it on my channel, where, because we've had our own, in the evangelical churches, there've been many, Rhett and Link. They often seem to be people from Christian rock bands. At least those are the ones that make the news. So it's interesting, let's say, comparing this to Europe, which, let's say, massively as cultures in different ways deconstructed. And again, with the fire in Notre Dame, that was an interesting moment, I think, because suddenly you had this sense, this maybe Tom Holland moment when are we or aren't we, or why do I care if that building's burning, or why is it not just a building? Here in many ways in Protestant land in the US, or at least in North America, where religion is this it's got to be a lifestyle choice. It's not something you can inherit. And of course, you've got deeply Protestant revivalist strains within that. If you're not living your religion consciously, intentionally, purposely, you don't possess it. And so obviously the deconstructions, you have to come out saying, you listen to Rhett and Link, and they all, they pretty much say, I felt disingenuous unless I would do a video making sure everybody knew I wasn't one of them anymore. It's like, oh, that's interesting. So
now.
Yeah. So what do you think about that?
So you're asking, what do I think specifically about
what's going on with these deconstructions and why
the American deconstruction template in particular?
But that's of course happening while we've got, I mean, Anthony Brandt on Twitter, you probably caught it, had tweeted something about Jordan Peterson, and of course I jumped on that and said, my disgust that so much of the American church and American clergy, that was happening, and they're like, yawn. And I'm thinking, this is one of the biggest things I've seen in my ministry lifetime in North America, and the church is just kind of, well, it's like, act.
Yeah, I know. Although I did know on Twitter, I noticed that he was asking specifically, are there any people with PhDs in the social sciences who have that? And I was like, well, why? I mean, why limit it? But I mean, he likes to. He has a little bit of that academic snobbery about it, But
but downstream of him, people were mentioning, and really fine Christian leaders. But to me, those answers reinforce the point.
It's the communication that's lacking. And then Tripp picked up on that and made a good thread of his own that I thought really worked. Yeah, the American deconstruction story.
In the context, we got this American deconstruction story while we've got a Douglas Murray and a Tom Holland feeling the haunting of the faith, and Jordan Peterson with, hours we could talk about the complexity of that whole picture, and all of this happening at the same time.
Yeah, I think even though there are differences, I do still also though see certain similarities though. Like I think Douglas is in some sense victim to some of the same things that Rhett and Link are, and some of these other guys. And the main sort of commonality that I see is just this. It's just sort of assumed as a matter of course that there's this friction or tension between religion and science, or faith and reason, or being a good Christian and being a good historian, being a good Christian and being a good scientist. And Holland feels this as well. Like he'll talk about how, I want so badly to surrender to the story, but then also he's a historian, and so he's thinking, on the one hand, but on the other hand, and it's almost like he feels like he's holding two hats, the would-be Christian hat and the proper modern historian hat. And he's not sure if he can wear those at the same time exactly. So this is a sort of assumed rift, or a sort of assumed friction that's been handed to all of these guys. It's handed to all of them when they're young but starting to ask questions, and then they encounter this, and then they panic. Like Douglas panicked, like Rhett and Link panicked. They're like, oh no, and now I'm like doomed to be a schizophrenic forever, unless I pick a side and jump. And I think Tom is on the verge of maybe picking the Christian side and jumping, even though he still has questions. But these other guys have decided to pick the atheist side and jump. And Rhett and Link even make that analogy. They said it feels like jumping off the side of a ship into an ocean, but I have no choice. Like I have to do that. And it's just, it's sad to me to see, because I think it's not true. Now, along with that, you've talked about in your video, when you talk about the real difference between Christians and atheists, it's not that Christians believe in God, but atheists don't believe in God. It's more like, well, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but it seems like what you're saying is the actual difference is um, atheists don't want to worry what's on God's mind, like Eric Weinstein puts it. Um, that atheists don't want the world to be like that, like Thomas Nagel puts it. Whereas Christians have made their peace with the world being like that. Is that accurate?
Yeah, well, I think that's, I was just thinking that again this morning, listening to someone who, oh, I was listening, I didn't finish it. I was listening to the Guy Sengstock, Jonathan Peugeot conversation this morning. And of course, Guy is, how to categorize Guy. That's really hard in and of itself. But there's a real, I think there's a deep fear of tyranny in atheist and agnostic circles, and it's a fear of a tyrannical church, and that's probably Protestant post-traumatic stress that's in generations. But when I heard, and actually I should be upfront about this. It was Eric Weinstein was on the Portal Discord server when he said those words, and when he said it, it was like bang,
Right.
right there. That's what I've been sort of seeing, but nobody just sort of put it right there. And because there's the terror, and of course Lewis, writes about this quite vividly. There's the terror that if this is true, then you're sort of falling into Lewis's trilemma, and you're beginning to recognize that if this is true, then there are consequences in terms of my life.
Right. And
That
yeah, and it was, I forget, it was Redderlink who was saying, if I don't have to believe this, then why would I? So, I mean, like, there's the two pieces of this. There's the, I'm looking for a reason not to believe this in some sense. Like, I'm really becoming deeply uncomfortable with believing this because of everything that you just said. But then also trying to read around and say, well, but like, if it were really true, then maybe I would have to believe it even though I don't want to. Oh, phew, looks like it's not true. Well, there goes that. And then they kind of check, that's the last thing. But they're trying, I mean, they'd like, I think, and some atheists would get really, really offended to hear us say this. Like, how dare you imply that I was just looking for a reason not to believe? I'm like, well, I'm sorry. I mean, I think very often that's true. And I mean, with Douglas in particular.
Oh, and in all fairness, I know many of the people I talk to, even some of whom at this point tell me I would really like to believe.
Yes.
I think we should respect the fact that they're not feeling it.
Well, right.
And
Yeah. And I want to get to that as well. And I mean, people are all different. People, no two people are exactly alike, of course. But with the Rhett and Link thing, I do think also, as I got further and further into their videos, they kind of shifted it. It became a lot of talk about the gay thing, a lot of talk about morality. And they actually read my my Patheos article, where I was like, well, I mean, that's kind of, yeah, that's sort of where the lines are drawn with the gay thing. And Rhett was like, okay, then, So that you've begun getting into some of that with stuff on your channel, but this idea of niceness, niceness as opposed to goodness. Well, the church is so mean to gay people. Okay, what do we mean by mean? Parsing all these different things. So I think that ends up looming maybe larger than anything else, particularly when you get into really personal things like my best friend was gay, my brother was gay. That's when we really start hitting at just the bullseye of this kind of stuff.
well, and it's so interesting to me because I know there's a something has happened in the generations with respect to this question. So I know people who are a little bit older than myself, or another generation older than myself, who were gay, had gay siblings, gay friends, et cetera, et cetera. They don't embody that same question in the way that it has. And so other things have changed. And to me, the far more interesting questions involve in what has changed. And, to get back to the question of the sort of Protestantality of American culture and the performative demand, part of what's really come out strong in American culture is this this performativity with queerness and sort of a non-binary sexuality, that there is, and Charles Taylor, gets at this. Julian pointed me back to Charles Taylor's chapter 13 and the secular age. And, I reread that recently, and there's a funny dynamic that has happened within that sphere, and that's very potent in America. You don't see that so much in someone like, say, Douglas Murray. And
no, in fact, he's pretty brutal about performative queerness. I mean,
yeah,
he comes down really, really hard on that, and it's quite funny. But he just has no patience or time for that.
Yeah, and so I think that gets into this. I think that's a part of the the performativity of deconstruction that we saw in Rhett and Link, where it is now my moral duty to come out and switch my flag. And you see that in the gender conversations in America too now. It's my moral duty to make my sexual preferences and appetites a public display. And that's different from Europe, obviously. And but there's deep connectivity in there with respect to, okay, so then what exactly are we talking about when we're talking about religion? In America, religion is something that you do. And in Europe, there seem to be struggling. Holland and Murray are struggling much more. Religious is an identity, and sexuality is an activity. And the conversation between Pajot and Rationality Rules, although he's a Brit, identity is sexuality, and it's like, how hard do you really want to push that downstream from, let's say, second wave feminism? How far do you really want to go down that road before you wind up you wind up basically not being able to maintain any identity at all, especially in your allergy to order that you fear might become tyranny. So I probably just gave word salad there, but
yeah. Well, and this is a point. This is a point where I disagree with Murray's whole kind of thesis. It matters of crowds, because he's trying to make the case that the rights train, so to speak, the LGBT rights train, was pulling nicely and calmly into the station, and everything was going swimmingly. And then along came trans, and it went off the rails, and now we're in postmodern la la land, where we don't even have basic categories of biology anymore. I questioned that history. I really do. And Glenn Scrivener actually independently made the same point in a bit of video commentary he did. But I don't think that train had a brake system ever at all. Like I don't think it was ever going to pull nicely into any station. I think it going off the rails was kind of baked in from the beginning, so to speak.
That's an interesting point. Now, and well, a lot depends on, okay, what track are they running on? Where does that track go? And really, where did that track come from? And so did it have to go this way? And part of my point that I've tried to make, and I haven't done another video on the same-sex stuff again, and I probably should get back to it. Sort of got derailed along with a bunch of other things by George Floyd, but and I've long asserted that the impetus for the impetus for reconsideration of a traditional sexual ethic in the church has at least partly accountable to Jesus' concern for the outcast. And that actually gets very interesting in a Pageauian sphere, where Jonathan Pageau, I think, nicely talks about the center and the fringe. And there's a degree in which you ought not try to banish the fringe, but center and fringe, of course, this grates against our performative egalitarian spirit. The center and the fringe need to be treated differently because the center is different from the fringe. And so in many ways, the impulse to say, hey, look at how we've treated this group of people. That's a deeply Christian question, and a deeply Christian motivation to say, look at how we've treated these people.
Right. But yeah, that's your phrase, the Christian Civil War, and right. Holland. I mean, that's what Holland's kind of trying to do. He's trying to see if he can kind of recast or reconstruct Christianity as the ultimate form of humanism, which I think that it is, although maybe not for quite all the same reasons. But sure, I mean, in Saudi Arabia, they just throw gays off a cliff, they don't care. I mean, look at Russia. Look at some ingenious torture methods for these people. And so right, the whole concept of giving rights, of giving dignity and whatnot, well, where's that all even coming from? Well, it's coming from the Christian seedbed.
Well, Esther, I've pestered you, and you've been very good. So we can pivot now and okay, Esther, what's on your list? What's on your list of?
Well, we can. I mean, I could try to not make this be like a hard hard.
I don't think it'll be hard, because I mean we're often conversing on similar things. There's a fair amount of overlap. We can talk about Peterson too, because there's lots of the second wave of Jordan Peterson, will it or won't it? But wherever you want to go.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I want to kind of using Murray still, but kind of using it to pivot it to some of the larger commentary that you've been making on the whole Peterson-Harris, going back to the Peterson-Harris dialogues and whatnot. So you were talking a lot about how Harris's idea of God, when he was bullying Peterson, and then Peterson broke out his long list of definitions of what God is, and Harris is like, stop, time. That's not what I'm talking about. That's not what God is or who God is. So you made a video where you were saying, well, I know why Sam Harris says that. He got that idea from Christians, because Christians never taught Sam how to look for God in nature.
You got that idea watching Christians, I would probably say.
Sure, or watching Christians. And so you were like, well, Sam doesn't know how to look for God or think about God properly, because these Christians he's listening to don't really understand that either. And so I was thinking about this when I read this blog post that somebody wrote. I don't know who he is, but he's a doctor, and I think Justin has been having him write stuff on different unbelievable dialogues. So he wrote something on my dialogue with Murray, and he got to the part where Justin popped the question, what would it take? And Douglas said, I think I would need to hear a voice, which was, it kind of took us by surprise. It was really just out of left field. And Douglas kind of unpacked what he meant by that, and it was really interesting. And again, he was trying to be really careful not to be flippant or glib about it, which I really appreciated. But then this blogger on Patheos had, I think, a really interesting, gracious response to that, which I think intersected with what you were saying, because this blogger was saying, well, I hear God's voice every day, just not the way that Douglas is referring to. He said, I hear I hear the symphony in the cell, the soliloquy at the sunset, the whisper in the wind. And it's God. I believe God never stopped speaking to us. But it's like the psalmist, the heavens declare. And so he said, I think Douglas maybe just doesn't recognize God's elocution, because he's kind of setting this bar so high. So he's kind of missing the quieter, the stiller, smaller voice, which may not, it's not dramatic like the way he spoke through the prophets, but that doesn't mean it's not real. And I wonder if maybe that gets at kind of what you were saying. And yet, I mean, I was thinking, reading that guy's blog post, it was a very evangelical blog post in many ways. The guy's clearly a, quite standard evangelical Protestant Christian. And so I was thinking, well, I see everything in here that Paul is sort of grousing about that he doesn't see. So I guess I would wonder, and I know you haven't read the article yet, but like, what do you feel would still be missing in that you're not seeing?
In Fiddler on the Roof, when Tevye asks his wife, "Do you love me?"
I suppose I do.
And they go back and forth, and
love that song.
Tevye wants to hear her say it.
Yeah.
And I think it could be perhaps that. Now, the thing about courting or tangling or wrestling with the Almighty is, he does like to play rough.
Yeah.
And just ask Job,
or
come on
Jacob.
down, I'm tired of this, won't you come down and face me? All right, Job, I will. So but I can appreciate that there's so many layers to that. I want to hear a voice. And because I think about one of my favorite things that Andy Crouch ever wrote was called A Testimony in Reverse. And if you Google that, Andy Crouch Testimony in Reverse, it was written quite a while ago, where he tells the story about how he was in love with someone, and there was a question about a move, and he knew that, so he just was begging and pleading with God, like a good evangelical, just be clear. And for the first time in his life, he heard an audible voice, and he decided to disobey the audio. I mean, that's how we are. And I think both of those realities are there, where on one hand, it's Tevye saying, "Do you love me?" And, I just say it. And on the other hand, that other point is exactly right. There's a story about Mother Teresa that is found in, I forget, it might be in Ragamuffin Gospel, where I forget the author of that book. He's another interesting dude. But where someone comes to Mother Teresa and says, "Would you pray for me?" And she says yes. And Mother Teresa herself is another very interesting person. But and she says yes. And then he says, "Well, what do you want me to pray for you for?" "I want you to pray for clarity." And Mother Teresa says, "I won't pray for that." And he's like, saints are supposed to be nice. It's like, you don't understand saintliness at all.
Well, Mother Teresa was not nice, but she was
good. and she was, and she says to him, she says, "I'm not going to pray for that, because that's not what you need. You need trust. That's what you need." Because and that's exactly what we do, is we imagine that what we're really dealing with is a matter of information. And I think the constant message of the Bible is that, no, it's not information. It's your heart. And I think if there's ever an example of that, it's of Jesus, because you would think, okay, Son of God, Son of Man, he would stand up, he'd have exactly the right words to say, and everyone would now start thinking correctly, and the world would be fixed. And the point of the story is, the Son of God, Son of Man comes and talks in a certain way that was sort of intriguing. And again, Tom Holland's line that I have used, in so many sermons since I heard him say it was, here's a message that has to go cross culture and through time, and it has, and this by 4 different authors. But the Son of Man comes and speaks, and we kill him.
Yep. Well, it's like going back, another great Fiddler on the Roof quote, probably my favorite quote actually. Yenta, the matchmaker, is talking to Gold, and she says, "Gold, I tell you, if God lived on Earth, people would break his windows." It's like, well done there now.
That's good.
Well.
I didn't remember that one.
Oh, it's fantastic. But no, you're exactly right. And of course, yeah, I completely agree with you that it's a very human, candid, and understandable thing. And this blogger, he quotes something from the writer Frederick Buechner, who kind of gives this scenario where God writes, "I exist" in the sky every night in different colors and all different languages, so that everyone in the world could see it and read it. It's like the sort of thing that atheists will say, well, I suppose if God would write "I exist" in the sky, then maybe,
in the genetic code.
Or yeah, I know Brett Weinstein gave that. So silly, Brett. I like Brett, but Brett can be so silly sometimes. Anyway, so then Buechner describes the scenario, and then he goes, "Now imagine a young man watching this with his father." And the young man turns to his father and he goes, "What difference does that make?" Like, okay, God exists. What then? What now? So this is what we're longing for. We don't merely long to know, okay, there's a being out there ising, existing. I need to know that he gives a damn, that he's willing to speak to me personally, and Douglas, when he mentioned that about hearing a voice, he said that he found it interesting that it's that desiring that sort of thing, giving voice to that desire is something that you could do way more comfortably in Eastern contexts than in Western contexts, where he says, if I'm sitting about at Oxford with a bottle of with a Negroni or whatever, it's like, oh, come off it. Oh, how silly, silliness, hearing a voice. And Douglas said, and I want to say, why? Why is that so silly? I mean, isn't that something that God used to do? And he said, but you wouldn't be thought completely mad if you talked about that in Africa or the Middle East, because that's where there's still a vibrant natural belief in that sort of thing.
Well, and for me, I mean, part of ever since I got on the YouTube train, which is taking me surprising places, but even though Adam, with his conversation with Jonathan, put it as the title of the video, which I thought was appropriate. I mean, what I see us really doing is wrestling with, well, what on earth do we mean by God?
Yeah.
Because I mean, all of the stated theology says the correct things, that God is finally not contained by our categories. God is finally not exhausted by our theological models that attempt to bear witness to him, and if you read the Bible, you will discover, most of the Bible is poetry. And if you throw in narrative, the vast majority of the Bible is poetry and narrative. And then then we want to go all kinds of, we want to embrace all sorts of cheats, like, well, God is impersonal. It's like, that's a dumb idea. Or God is a super thing in the sky. It's another dumb idea. That even an honest, credible, engaging with the literature surrounding these 3 little letters in English is going to it's going to take you in some it's going to take you to some places you might not necessarily think you want to go. And so I have a degree of respect for those who stand at the border and hesitate. That's not, that's, you know, they're exhibiting something that others who don't hesitate at all going one way or the other across the border don't have an appreciation for.
Yeah. But so then, I mean, I think going back to the beginning, what I was kind of wondering about is, what is it when you say, well, the Christians never showed Sam how to see God in nature? Like, what is that thing that's missing, do you think? And I mean, do you think something like what that blogger was saying is closer to what you're looking for, or what's your beef, I guess?
T.H. Lerman, who's an anthropologist from Harvard, instead of trying to desperately find some people on the planet who have not somehow been contaminated by this great imperial maw that continues to consume the planet, decided to be an anthropologist at a vineyard church and wrote a book, When God Talks Back. And, you know, I thought the book was deeply respectful and helpful because in some ways it was an attempt for these two worlds to connect. And there's just so many cheap shots in talking about this Iron Age God and connecting it to modern American Christians, whether they be evangelical or Pentecostal or Roman Catholic or even Episcopalian, and start
Those
talking.
Aren't Christians. But continue.
And so, Esther, and you know, they're not holding slaves, are they? Why? You know, and at least Brett Weinstein had an appreciation that what actually happens in the church is a moving through time. And but it's easy to see the Christian who, you know, runs into the gym with some grateful exasperation. I couldn't find a parking space to make it into my cycling class on time. And I said, Jesus, provide a way. And one opened up and here I am. You know, okay, Sam Harris, fair enough. We're like that sometimes. But there are layers to this that that the quick dismissal, you know, is but yet the, you know, Christians should ponder the fact that the quick dismissal was effective. But then there was that tweet that someone tweeted that I first found Sam Harris and he led me to Jordan Peterson and he led me to Vervaeke and Peugeot and Vanderklay. And now I'm thinking about going to church. And so I blame Sam Harris. So that brings me back to Lewis, that, and what I've seen in the last 3 years is, you know, and on my channel, let's say even just with the story of Job, as Lewis said, an atheist can't be too careful about their reading.
Oh, and I gave Job some of that reading, and he, you know, he's Job is so honest. It's what we all love about him. But you know, he's told me there are things he recommended that made me think. And you know, it's like no one single thing was the thing. You know, but it's the slow accumulation. Maybe I could use Job to help kind of pivot to another question I had, which is, so when you're talking about when you talk about LARPing, I'd like to know a little more, because I feel like that can be a word or a phrase that fudges, and so I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of things that you would kind of put in that category that I would say that's all great. I mean, you know, try a church if it's a good church. Yeah, you know, try a church, talk to Christians, read the Bible, try some God if you're out there style praying, which I have no contempt for at all. I think that could be a valuable thing. Peterson's sitting on the edge of the bed. Um, I think all of that is good and should be recommended, but I think there's a limit to it because um, you know I, I have a very strong feeling that there's certain things that you really should not, in good conscience, be doing unless you can affirm the whole schlemiel. So where do you think LARPing runs out, so to speak?
Well, I think you're right. Job was invited to partake in communion from his
Right.
pastor,
That's what I'm thinking of. Yeah.
and Job said, "I'm not ready."
Yeah.
You know, where Living Stones is desperately in need of flesh under 70, and so one of
I'll come
our
visit you sometime, Paul. I'll come sit in a pew and be
we
under
don't have
70 for
pews. We're a California church. We have chairs.
you. Okay.
Um, but and so you know one of our deacons was kind of leaning on Rick to become a deacon. And first of all, it's like, that's not how we make deacons. And I said, and secondly, he hasn't been baptized yet. And I mean,
Right.
and Rick has been, gosh, what Rick hasn't given to this church. But Rick is, and you'll probably embarrass him a little bit because he's a very quiet person, but he's serious about, and I find this often where a sort of casual familiarity develops within the church, or within a family that is deeply participatory within church, that many outside of the church have perhaps a bit more wisdom about, and are and sometimes take some of these things more serious than those of us who are familiar and have lived with it, and have been around it, don't. So no, your point is well made. And I think, but this gets back to the conversation that I had with this. He knows exactly who I'm talking about, and he's feeling the pressure, but he's not going to bend because he wants to have another conversation where he does it right. And I thought, well, the first one was really good, but anyway, we're this sort of gets into my estuary word, where what's happening in, I see the Jordan Peterson space, the Bridges of Meaning Discord, the meetups, is that people are, they want to hear more, they want to see more, they want to be respected, and they want their distance respected, and there was, for all of its other issues, that was sort of the idea behind Bill Hybels' seeker service, that here people are a little skittish, so here we're going to have a place for people to be skittish. Now this stuff gets really complex because we bump into reformational issues in terms of, so when I was in Australia, I went to Warren Mills Church, which is the oldest Anglican church in Melbourne. And, so I partook of communion in the Anglican church, and I had to kneel at a rail. And for me, it was like, oh, here's the mythical rail that we learned in our Protestant
You're in my
indoctrination.
territory now, Paul. This is my stopping grounds.
Oh yeah. So
yeah.
So there's, for me, there's even there's this is a very live conversation, and we're discovering the meaning. We're discovering some of the meaning behind Chesterton's fences. Here's a fence. Oh, well, I don't see the reason for that fence. Well, but someone at one point saw a reason for that fence enough to put it up. Maybe you should pause and have a little bit of humility and not be so quick to chop it down. So,
Well, it actually, interestingly, apparently so Brett Weinstein and Heather Heying are working on a book that's coming out in spring. And they're all Chestertonian. I'm going, really? Well, this is interesting. Okay, and I
Yes,
had exactly the same thought that you did when you saw them like quoting long passages of Rod Dreher on their podcast. I'm like, so a couple of California lib Dems quoting from Rod Dreher's latest at length, and I mean, like,
they're from Oregon. They're from
okay,
Portland.
but they
That's
grew up in
California, but
California.
more so.
Yeah, well, right, exactly. Yeah. I mean, like, these are strange times, but I think about it and I think, well, I mean, these things are true. So I suppose it makes sense that if you're, if you're a basically sort of decent, honest person with some modicum of intellectual integrity and social sense, uh, you might be able to sort of look around and begin drifting towards some of the same true things, you know?
Well, and to get to, let's say, to come around to the IDW space, I mean, this has been I think the IDW space has been one of the more culturally interesting spaces that we've seen in terms of atheists, you know, wandering over to Christiany things, political progressives being kicked out of the blue church. I mean, it's been one of the more dynamic spaces, and
I know, I mean, I don't really, I don't spend any time like I don't keep up with any of the apologetics spaces really much at all. I don't really tune into Christian channels, podcasts, things like that. Um, I just don't find it any of it interesting. I mean, even though I might like agree with everything that's said, but there's no change, you know. And I mean, I think that's what attracts me to this whole corner, the
yeah,
whole IDW corners. Things are changing constantly. There's like new stuff getting thrown out, although sometimes it can stagnate. Like you were pointing out, the Dark Horse podcast has gotten kind of repetitive, and Eric kind of ran out of steam with the portal. And I mean, it's like once Peterson was gone, they kind of lost their way. They all kind of, they just each had their different things, and they couldn't, there's nothing like holding them together really, you
right.
know.
So that brings us to the big daddy. Let's talk about Jordan.
Okay, yeah,
So
sure.
so Proverbs. What do you think about that?
I think it's a safe choice.
Well, given what he's been through, it's probably good for him to take a safe choice.
Yeah, it's fine. Like, I mean, look, the guy's earned the right to do whatever he damn well pleases. I'm not gonna complain at all. And this, I'll be interested to see with this new book how personal he gets. Whether because like you, I found the chapter on his daughter. I mean, initially it wasn't through the book, but through a lecture he gave where he was kind of like giving an overview of the book, and then he got to that part, and that was one of the very first Jordan Peterson videos I ever saw that completely blew me away. And I just left me jaw on the floor, like, oh my gosh, this guy is a revelation. I've never seen anything like this in my life, really, a figure like this, so raw and vulnerable. And so I'll be interested to see if the new book digs into that kind of thing more, because that would be really brave if he did. But it might be, um, you
Might be
know,
too early because that
well,
book had
it might be too
started.
early.
I mean, maybe his book to come. Do you think there's going to be another wave like before? What do you think's going to happen?
I don't think there will ever be a a wave as high as this one. I think he may sort of, well, and especially with COVID having turned everything upside down, because Peterson thrived on the speaking circuit. Um, that was where his magic really came together. There was some discussion of this in the threads on Twitter this morning. People pointing out that, and like Tripp and Paul Anleitner were pointing this out, that it was in his communication, his live in person speaking communication, that the magic really happened. Um, and now the world has turned upside down with all this. Um, who knows when that kind of a medium or a channel for his ideas will really ever return. And I think also, I mean, I don't know, he caught certain political waves, political moments, cultural flashpoints. And I mean, maybe there'll be more of those later, but he always needed some kind of a thing to galvanize to get going, and then it kept rolling on its own steam. But I don't know that there'll be anything new like that again in the future. But I think he'll just kind of gradually start writing again, and and he'll give a lot of Zoom seminars, no doubt, in future. But I think people will come to see him as a has-been, like with other figures before him, and it's not going to catch lightning in a bottle again. It's my instinct. With the choice to do Proverbs, I mean, me personally, I was actually slightly disappointed when he said that, because I mean, it's fine. Like it's a fine choice. There's nothing, definitely it fits with his whole oeuvre as a wisdom guy, a wisdom book guy, Ecclesiastes guy. Ecclesiastes would have been really interested. I would have been more interested by that. But like I wanted to do the Gospels. I wanted to do something like really dangerous, something really, really meaty. But I mean, it makes sense because he's just now kind of recouping. I mean, I saw he had like about an hour chat with Coleman Hughes the other day, and Michaela was talking about how like he just has no energy to set things up, and so she like kind of worked it out with Coleman, and it was like, okay, Dad, I'll handle it. You don't have to do anything. You can just talk. And they had a very nice, easygoing chat. And Coleman's a great guy to talk to for that kind of thing. But that kind of gave me a little window into, okay, he's really not back to full capacity. This is still very much an ongoing process,
Yeah. I think you're right. Proverbs, as a preacher, I know Tim Keller would work Proverbs often, but I've never attempted to do much with the book in terms of homiletics or even a Sunday school class, partly because the form of the book is deceptively complex, and how to engage with, even because there's a proverb, but that proverb is set amidst an entire. So I'm very curious to see where he goes with that. He can tend to get proverbial, which means that if he just picks a proverb out of the book and decides that's going to be his launching place from which to, ramble for an hour or two, well, it might be okay, might not. I don't know how many of the book tour lectures you've listened to, but again,
a lot. Yeah.
I didn't find them to be quite as fresh as, at least what happened. And again, I think you're exactly right that it wasn't just him. It was, the man and the moment sort of found each other and brought that together. But it was quite interesting, though, that he seems to, his gift of attracting controversy seems to still be operational. So,
yeah, and all the usual, and I saw you like retweeting like all the usual suspects lining up to defend him. You're like, it's happening again. It's happening again. Yeah. Oh, there goes Douglas Murray. Oh, there goes Andrew Doyle. Oh, there goes Claire Lemon, and all those people going, this is outrageous. You're like, it's happening. But so of course, every time the guy writes a book, there will be a little spike where somebody somewhere is crying over it. So that will help, of course it will help sales. And I mean, I could sort of see, I could picture the Penguin executive meetings where they're kind of listening politely, like, and then behind closed doors, they're like, is it, keep going, cha-ching. There goes the big
There's
bucks.
no way our stockholders are going to let us pass on this book.
Absolutely. No, no, no
Do
way. And so,
people not
yeah.
understand how few books sell?
Yes, I know. I have a really good friend. One of my best friends, Hannah Long, works at HarperCollins as an editor. And so, I mean, like she like interacts with some big name people, but as a behind the scenes person, and she could tell you all about this. She could tell you all about how, but will it sell? But will it sell when somebody pitches? You know, it's like, convince me that this will sell. You know.
Yep. Yep.
So Peterson's paying for all those people, and so I mean, Peterson is it's so interesting because in some ways he's been the victim of so much tragedy.
Yeah.
You know, like all this like deep personal misfortune, and but then in other ways he's been remarkably fortunate. Um, you know, the way like he's pretty much guaranteed to always be able to publish and sell books. You know, and like there's a crowd of loving fans waiting for him anytime he wants to go back out on a stage. You know, um, and yet he's troubled. You know,
Yeah.
it always will be the man of sorrows acquainted with grief. I mean,
Yeah.
and I don't mean that blasphemously, but
Yeah.
it's true.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's true. So looking forward to 2021, we're about at the end of the year. What kinds of things are you looking for as
And
we?
Peterson, or
No, just in general.
just
Um,
just in
what
general?
kinds of things? So Douglas Murray, of course, as your interest. Tom Holland. What other things out there maybe that we haven't talked about are you kind of looking for or thinking about? Or I know you've got some academic stuff that you're sort of tying a ribbon on right now. But what kinds of things are you kind of anticipating for the new year?
Uh, so did you want me to think about like talk a little about my own work, or what I
Wherever you ever want to go with this.
I'm starting to write fiction, which has been fun. I've learned a lot. My learning curve is it's been a learning curve. Um, but
Why fiction?
I've always loved it. I mean, literature has been always my first love, ever since I was a little teeny tiny kid. Um, and so, I mean, you know, Lewis reached me first through his fiction,
Yeah.
with the Narnia books, and then when I got older, the space trilogy and all that stuff. Um, and and Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, I remember first reading that when I was 8, and then rereading it as I get older, and you see more and you learn more. It grows with you. Those great stories. Um, and I talk about this on my Reset interview that's coming out with Glenn Scrivener. But we so much of what we've learned through story, and so many things. Story helps us to make sense. It's a sense-making mechanism. You know, we talked about sense-making mechanisms, particularly for things like suffering and evil. You know, light versus dark, good versus evil, where you can talk in philosophical terms, abstract terms about these things, and you can publish journal articles and bioethics journals and that kind of thing. But you know, in some sense they fall short until they're connected to story. And so it's always been, I guess, a sort of a dream of mine to see if I could do that myself. And I still don't know if I can. I mean, it's a lot of people go, I'm gonna write a novel. It's like, well, okay, cool, good luck with that. You know, so that's kind of what I'm telling myself. But I feel like I might be able to. And I mean, like I'm approaching, like I'm tripping over all kinds of landmines, you know, including like very political hot button type issues. But I'm thinking about ways into it that are humane, that create characters that you can love, that are deeply flawed, maybe, and deeply screwed up, maybe even Christian and also deeply screwed up, which is not something that we grapple with enough, I don't think. but how grace can still come in, how light can still come in. And I was thinking about this when you were talking with Poe recently, and the brothers Karamazov, and Ivan's story of the little girl beating against the door because her parents are abusing her. And with Glenn, I mentioned how Christopher Hitchens used that story a lot. Like that was like one of his big trump cards that he would throw out there, like throwing down the gauntlet, you know. And the Christians in response would be, well, okay, here's a theodicy, you know, here's a okay, well, arguments against the problem of evil. And they were good theodicies. I mean, you can, I think, philosophically answer the problem of evil. But it's the story that sticks with you. You know, that was Hitch's genius, you know, is that he was such a masterful rhetorician. He knew how to get people in the palm of his hand. And so, you know, what can you set against that? Well, you can set good arguments, but you also have to set a better story against it. So I think about that a lot. I just think about it a lot. And it's, if someday I was able to contribute to it, that would be one of my proudest achievements, I think.
It's a big goal. It's a big goal.
It is definitely. I think also I'm not done with Holland. I'm not done with Murray or those guys. You know, I would love to, or the Weinsteins for that matter.
Yeah.
I would like to. I mean, this goes back to when I said Tom needs a good marriage counselor. You know, I want to kind of set forth the proposition that one doesn't need different hats to navigate this terrain. You know, if one is considering Christianity, I want to propose that it's something that Christianity is something that you can enter into as a fully integrated individual. It's not going to require you to suppress some nagging part of yourself, or to pretend that certain things don't exist. This is something Brett Weinstein says, which actually I really like this phrase. And if I talked with Brett sometime, I would remind him of this and say, I agree. Where he said, all true stories must reconcile. I think that's profoundly true, more true than Brett realizes, I think. Because I think all true stories have already reconciled and do reconcile. But I recognize that's a process for people. And so it's not my intention to rush anybody with undue haste through that process. But I want to try to make the case that it can be done. Because I think it should be done. And, you know, you'll talk about how people work, and you'll be like, well, okay, that's easy for you to say. You'll sometimes say, like, well, you would say that, you know, because you think that way. You think in this kind of hyper rational way, which maybe I don't as much as you think necessarily. But I don't think it's just me. I think a lot of people want to be integrated. I think Poe wants to be integrated.
Oh, yeah.
I think is it Ryan Bennett? Is that the name of the?
Yeah.
Yeah, Ryan Bennett.
IDW Protocol.
Yeah, that guy. He wants to be integrated.
Yeah.
I think that is part of how people work, is wanting to bring the pieces of themselves together.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I don't think that you can indefinitely keep the different parts of yourself separated from each other. I think it's good to seek integration in a, you know, not in the Jungian way, but stealing the term from Jung. So I think that is possible, and I think there's been some good that's come out of the Christian apologetics movement, but also there's been some not so good, and there have been approaches trotted out and things which, I mean, I've talked to Tom a little bit behind the scenes about some of these fast resurrection arguments that you touched on in a video, like, okay, 5 minimal fats, that prove that Jesus rose from the dead. And I know that Tom has seen that kind of thing. It's not like he's unfamiliar with it. Didn't do it for him,
Yeah.
And I understand why, because it actually doesn't do it for me either. I think something better is needed, something more robust, something fuller. But I think this is great news, and I want to I'm trying to kind of shout good news from the rooftops that this can be done. It's possible. You can do this. Not everybody will want to, though, and that, of course, that's completely out of my hands. That's in God's hands.
Yeah. Well, I agree. And the in terms of the resurrection, we're at a point now where a lot of people are skeptical about it for, I think, some rather shallow reasons. But even once, so I come at this as a preacher, and I regularly talk to a preacher in a fairly conservative denomination, moderately conservative denomination, let's say, and most people, if you'd ask them, did Jesus walk out of the tomb with their flesh? Oh yes. It's not a question for them. But then I, as a pastor, will watch them worry. I'll watch them anxious. And the resurrection and our anxieties and our worry are live in the same universe. And so it's long been a preacher thing to say, well, you don't really believe the resurrection because you worry. And then people, what do you mean by that? When Jesus commands them, well, we know that same-sex sexuality is wrong because God commands it. Oh, okay. Well, Jesus commands you not to worry. Well, that's undoable. Oh, okay.
Then I'm in trouble.
Yeah. And so, no, you're exactly right. And it's the integration that we long for, and it's the reconciliation of our stories. And it's not just the reconciliation of these things in terms of the impressive cognitive models and frameworks we're able to sort of manage in our gray matter. It's the complete, and I think that's, I've said many times, my journey over these last 3 years with respect to YouTube has made, and even given with all the different characters that I've talked to, I'm not less convinced of the necessity of the physicality of the resurrection. I'm more so.
Yeah.
And I'm more convinced of the, in my little miracles conversation with Vervaeke and J.P. Marceau, when, I talked to, I think I don't quite know what John thought when I told him about, walking on water. And, he kind of had to, take a step back, sort of like poor Stephen Wolfert when Jonathan Peugeot says, no, I do believe in God. I was like, whoa, wait a minute. And, and actually, if you listen to the Peugeot Guy Sengstock conversation that I'm only a third of the way through, there's some moments in there too where
crying game moments.
Yeah, where Peugeot says some things and people are, do you really think that that basically what it boils down to in Charles Taylor language, do you really believe we are that vulnerable to God and his power and his presence? And I would say, yes, I do. And nothing I hear about in the philosophical space, nor in the on the street space, makes me think less so. And what that means is that all of our little, when I hear Douglas Murray say, "I'll need to hear a voice," I think, oh, be careful.
I know. That's what I wanted to say. I wanted to ask him later. I was kicking myself. I should have said, well, Douglas, what do you want the voice to say?
Oh, be careful, because if you demand that the Almighty knock on your door, just what I've seen from people, his knock can sometimes be that still small voice, or his knock can be the whirlwind that destroys, that collapses the home of in which Job's children lived.
Mm.
And this is something that I think, when it comes to modernity, and I don't mean modernity in terms of the technical philosophical sense, but I think the um, the European civilization, from deism forward, when we sort of got a little bit drunk on our capacity to do modern medicine and build good levees, and when we began to sort of bring a little bit of our own order to the world to shape it more to our liking, um, we we have we have we have forgotten who we are talking about. And I think, whereas, yes, there's plenty of tragedy in this pandemic that, I as a pastor can certainly see, but it is also a sober reminder of exactly what and who we are. And okay, maybe we'll have a vaccine. Maybe we'll have some vaccines that put an end to this. I surely hope so. I, more, as much as anyone else, wants to be free of these cursed masks and restrictions. But what really offends us, I think, is the fact that God is God and we are not, and we're simply never going to get around that. And if God is God and we are not, then how, in fact, do we contend with the fact that the Almighty will have thoughts and opinions about us and power over our destinies that He does not simply yield to our control?
Yes, exactly. That powerlessness is something that COVID has so brought home, and I think it's so interesting to see how the same people who will very, very loudly and vocally advocate that you should be able to kill yourself whenever you want to are now suddenly like, oh my gosh, we might die of a virus. We have to do this, we have to do that, da da da. Well, what's the difference? Well, it's because the one thing is something you can control. The other thing is something you can't control. That's what you're putting your finger on there, I think, is the reminder that, oh shoot, I'm actually not running this ship, am I?
Well, Esther, I knew this would be a pleasure. And I always enjoy chatting with you and swapping ideas, and anything you want to promote, or anything you want to, I mean, you've got, I mean, you're sort of, you've been publishing in some other places lately too.
Yeah, so I mean, I occasionally update my Patheos blog, Young Fogey, but I mean, weirdly, it's so odd. 2020 of all years, but I haven't actually been writing there as much as I used to. Maybe it drove me into a certain state of lethargy. Also the fiction, I guess, working on that.
Yeah.
But so my Twitter, Esther of Riley, is like kind of the one-stop place where any new thing that I write, I promote it or tweet it there. And so most recently, I was actually writing at the Spectator about a little diner that's rebelliously staying open despite pandemic strictures, and so kind of tipping my hand a little bit where I sit with all that. I have my opinions, but we were, this talk was sort of blessedly free of COVID talk. So basically, my Twitter is kind of the space to watch for new stuff that's up with me.
Okay. Well, I will send you this recording, and then when it's ready, I'll post it. And I'm anxious to see what Sam on the Discord server said. Aren't you talking to Esther? I said, yeah, it's coming up. It's coming up. So I know some folks are looking forward to this. So, but
Well, yeah, I wasn't sure what would happen, but we got it on the calendar. We just had to make it happen. So it's been a pleasure. Thanks so much for hosting me, Paul.
Thank you, Esther.